Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And this is the Second Reading Podcast for the week of, what week are we on?
August 2nd,
3rd,
yeah,
something like
August
that?
2nd.
Summer is flying by for us as well as for you, I'm sure. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas. I'm joined by, as you can hear, my colleague Josh Blank.
Good morning, afternoon, or evening.
This week, we want to talk a little bit about the politics of guns on campus as the so-called campus carry law goes into effect here at UT and at public colleges throughout Texas. And if you're wondering why I said public, you'll find out shortly. Then we'll circle back and wrap up the Democratic National Convention last week and the somewhat surprising politics that have come out of it, especially the reactions to the speech by the Khan family. And again, if you don't know what I'm talking about with the Khan family, you'll find out soon enough. But right out of the barrel, let's start with guns. Monday, the concealed carry law passed by the last legislature went into effect in Texas. And as it turned out, by, I think, what can only be called an unhappy coincidence. It went into effect on the 50th anniversary of the mass shooting on the UT campus in 1966, which is now, retroactively known as the first mass school shooting in American history. Rather than focus on that, though it may come up, we want to focus on campus carry. Campus carry was a big legislative issue for several sessions.
Yeah, it's something that had sort of been around for a while, and it kind of, I don't know, you can say it persevered. Like there were some ideas early on about, trying to allow for, more guns on K through 12 campuses, and that was really a tricky area. But campus carry was something that was sort of always sitting there kind of at the periphery until the 2015 session, and then it finally kind of burst through, although it took a lot of work.
Yeah, in some ways it's, without digressing too far, people are rolling their eyes right now.
Yeah.
I can feel it.
I
can feel the eye rolling.
This whole thing is a huge digression, but keep going.
But the campus carry law really is interesting test case, and this really does connect with things that we've written about that are in the textbook, et cetera, of how ideas take a while to germinate in the legislative process very frequently and more largely in the public policy process. Campus carry was a little bit of a fringe idea that was seized on by a legislator in 2011 who's no longer in the legislature, frankly, as a way of burnishing his conservative credentials. He was somebody that he was a Republican from San Antonio, but who was known as something of a moderate, mainly because he was pro-choice. He was really the only pro-choice Republican in the Senate delegation, at least publicly. And so he would be in trouble for being pro-choice, and then he would choose issues that he could prove that he was a conservative about. And in 2011, he really went to the mat on campus carry and frankly kind of pissed a lot of people off in the legislature by being insistent about it very late in the 2011 session. Nonetheless, that terrain really shifted partially as a result of political change in the state and the infusion of an even more powerful conservative presence in the Republican Party and in the legislature, so that in 2015, we go into that session with lots of talk about guns, right? I mean,
right. I mean, before the session even started, there was a sort of a very loud movement, right? Which was looking to ease gun restrictions in the state, and particularly, they were looking for an open carry provision, because Texas is actually, when it was before the 2015 session, was one of the few states that didn't have some form of open carry. We have, license.
Well, they had a certain form because you could carry long guns.
Right, you could carry long guns around, but you couldn't carry handguns openly. You'd have to have a licensed, concealed handgun license, and therefore you could carry it in a concealed fashion. But you just couldn't
openly strap it on.
Right. But they basically, early in the session, had made clear that they wanted to push for something they called constitutional carry, which is basically the notion...
Which is even one step beyond open carry.
Right. It's a step beyond open carry. It's the notion that because of the Second Amendment, we are all legally allowed to carry guns. It shouldn't be licensed at all, and we can carry them any way that we want. And this group was very, very loud and very, very active from really before the session even began.
Well, and even if you think back, I don't know how much you remember, but there was, I mean, what they did, which was really smart, is the open carry and constitutional carry folks were on the Capitol grounds protesting, toting long guns around legally.
Right.
The first day of the session, opening day and really opening week, they had a series of open and constitutional carry.
There was a big conflict with Pancho Nevarez, right? They came to his office and he said,
Right. The open carry guys went in there and got in an argument with a Democratic legislator. And then that week, and again, we're getting into the weeds here, but we're going to get into the weeds a little bit here. Dan Patrick, the lieutenant governor, did a opening session interview for the Texas Tribune with our friend and colleague Evan Smith, in which he talked down the possibility of new open carry legislation passing.
Right. He just said he didn't think the votes were there.
He didn't think the votes were there, which just got everybody in an uproar. Had people accusing him of selling out the conservatives now that he was lieutenant governor, and that really put open carry on the agenda for the lieutenant governor very quickly. So at the end of the session, we got both a new open carry law and the campus carry law, which was implemented this week at the University of Texas and all over the state. So the idea here is that they passed a law that said that public universities and private universities, asterisk, would come up with their own policies, but that the public universities were really hemmed in on the degree to which they could limit concealed carry in different places. So the law was written in a way that made it de facto pretty impossible to keep guns out of classrooms, for example.
They basically said that the public universities could designate gun-free zones, but that those designations couldn't have the effect of basically, removing concealed carry from the campus.
There had to be a rationale for this, and that was the outer bound.
And while sort of the campuses, and then through the campuses, eventually the boards of regents approving these sort of, let's say, particular policies for implementation, while this process was going on, a lot of legislators came out and were very clear, made very clear to the universities and to the board of regents, if you do create policies that have the effect of banning guns on campus, we will come back and make this much, much more strict and take away any discretion you think you have. Right.
And we should mention that now there are 3 professors at UT that are suing to have this, this law overturned or at least altered. That case is pending. But the politics of this have really continued to evolve. I want to play an audio excerpt. Now, this is Senator Brian Birdwell, who was the Senate sponsor of the bill. The House sponsor was Alan Fletcher. And Senator Birdwell is a Republican from Waco who defended this bill, but also defended the carve-out, if you will, that is the right of private universities to opt out. So this is Brian Birdwell on a I think it may be a syndicated radio show, but it's definitely an internet radio show that is sponsored by the National Rifle Association, the major interest group in favor of gun rights. And this is him on the Kamen Company show right after the bill, or as the bill was going through the process and was about to be passed.
Our constitutional duty is to protect all constitutional rights equally, not favor one to the detriment of another. And, we could talk about other things that your show is not themed to, and I won't bore you with those. But, a private university, education is a commodity just like coffee. So whether it's the coffee shop that wants to preclude the concealed carry holder in Texas or any other state that honors the private property wishes of that independent business, that is that property owner's right. And then at that point, the CHL of the Second Amendment enthusiast can make a marketplace decision on whether to patronize that business or not. It's no different with private property rights for universities and their property and education being a commodity. And so one of the things that we did was when we came back over, we asked for conference committee because I wanted that taken out so that we could not only protect the Second Amendment rights of citizens of Texas, but protect the private property rights of the private property owners in those private universities. We still make them go through the decision-making process that we make the publics go through, but they have the ability to decide we don't want this on our campus or not because that is their private property, no different than a mom-and-pop on the corner courthouse square.
Now, there's a couple of interesting things about this, and one is, a kind of broad point that, you often have issues in which people are intensely interested, like gun rights. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that's happened with gun rights is that it's given rise to what some people, and I think it makes sense, it sounds derogatory, but I don't think it is, called kind of Second Amendment fundamentalism, which views the right to bear arms expansively and fundamentally and as a right, in some ways the way people view the First Amendment almost as something that, is kind of gets a pride of place, and that you really have to have a reason, and a very good reason, to limit people's right to carry guns.
Some people might call it a fundamental freedom.
Right, exactly. And so, what you're seeing here is that as this went through the process, I kind of suspect that this was something that folks had not really thought through completely, that the private universities were going to be a different kind of issue, and that it did bump up against another kind of fundamental right, particularly for conservatives, and that's property rights. And, you don't really have to expand. I think Senator Birdwell gave a pretty good explanation for why he was thinking about that. And the political process tends to bring out these competing interests. And in this case, there was a real fundamental collision. And in terms of the politics of this, we should also note that Senator Birdwell has one of the major private universities in the state, Baylor, is in his district. And it's hard for me to imagine he didn't get an earful from the Baylor regents and maybe even the then Baylor president, Ken Starr. And in fact, Baylor did fairly quickly opt out and does not allow concealed carry on campus.
Right. Only one private university actually decided to allow concealed carry on campus. And the politics of this are really interesting too, because, if you think about the mechanics, by default, the private universities were basically by law adopting concealed carry on their campuses unless they opted out. Right. So what this allows a politician to do is to say, yeah, I passed, concealed carry on college campuses statewide. To the extent that these private universities chose not to opt into it, one, it's their property rights, and two, that's not on me, right? Exactly. That is on them. I mean, it's interesting. I think there's a sort of, at the time I kind of hadn't thought about this as much, but there is a sense where you say, well, does the state have the ability to, force, concealed carry onto private institutions? And the answer is sure, because the fact is there's tons of state money that goes to these institutions in the form of scholarships and other things that they could say they would withhold or whatever if they didn't pass this law. There are ways that the legislature could have done this, but they didn't want to deal with the politics of it. And so this is actually a very nice and neat way to get around it, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. Now, the other piece of this that we want to talk about quickly, I think, is the fact that public opinion is very interesting around guns, particularly in Texas. I think we have this sense Texas is a conservative state, self-images and cultural images around guns, very powerful. But public opinion looks kind of evenly divided, edging towards gun rights at times. But then when you really unpack that, we see a pattern that we see in a lot of issues like this, where public opinion looks at the top level overall, even kind of evenly divided.
Right. So going into that session, in February of 2015, when asked about campus carry, 47% of Texas voters said they supported this notion of the right of individuals to carry if they're licensed, concealed on campus, and 45% were in opposition. So it's basically evenly split. But if
result which we got a lot of crap from our colleagues.
Sure. If you look just at Republicans, 69% were supportive of it, 25% were opposed. And if you look at Democrats, only 23% were supportive, 70% were opposed. So the way you get to sort of an even split is the fact that the parties are completely, at opposite ends of the spectrum on this issue, right? Among self-identified Tea Party Republicans, 86% were in favor.
Right, the Tea Party being kind of the conservative core of what is, the Republican Party. And, folks that were, that the driver's seat over-dramatizes, maybe a little too hyperbolic, but the Tea Party, people that identify as the Tea Party are mobilized, politically active conservatives who, are given a lot of attention by Republican elected officials in the legislature that have strong Tea Party contingents in their districts.
Right. Because, what it really comes down to is these are the people who are going to vote in primary elections,
right, which
is the main concern for a lot of these legislators. I mean, an interesting thing that kind of comes out of sort of the overall politics of that session around guns that we sort of started with, we asked in that same poll about basically how people felt about Texans' right to carry guns around the state.
Kind of more universally.
More universally in public places. And what we found is that, 45% of Texans were basically happy with the status quo at the time, which is, you can carry a concealed handgun if it's licensed. And that's, again, 45% overall. That included 50% of Republicans, actually. So most Texans were pretty happy with the status quo.
And interestingly, in terms of the political culture in the state, 43% of Democrats.
Yeah, 43% of Democrats. Now, the other 43% of Democrats wanted there to be no guns carried in public places. But this sort of kind of cuts to a theme in public opinion in Texas, which is the Texas Democrats tend to be a little bit more conservative than elsewhere. And that's kind of actually what oftentimes drives the sort of actual conservatism of Texas beyond other states. But when we asked about constitutional carry, only 10% of Texans wanted to make the state sort of a constitutional carry state. This was only 14% of the GOP. But it was 30% of self-identified Tea Party Republicans, so the same group. So one of the things that you kind of also see in this process is sort of, and you see this in public opinion, is one, how sort of these overall trends can hide some important underlying partisan differences. And when you're trying to understand why something becomes a priority, if you just look at the overall results, you're actually missing a lot of the story. But the other piece of this is sort of, I guess, a case of, pluralism or whatever, if you want to call it that.
Pluralism or whatever is what they call it in political science.
Political science, I know. I wish I was a political scientist. But 30% of Tea Party Republicans were for this constitutional carry. And again, this is a very active group. So it wasn't a large group of Texans.
And again, constitutional carry being
free, unfettered,
complete, unfettered, actually no government regulation of
guns at
carrying
all.
Guns.
Right. And so this is, not a large group in Texas, but it's an intense minority. So to some degree, some of it was the way Patrick handled it at the beginning of the session. Some of it was this group's sort of loud intensity before the session started. But also, this is how a small but intensely mobilized group can actually make policy change. They didn't get exactly what they wanted, but to the extent that, campus carry had been this sort of fringe policy that had been floating around for a couple of sessions, and all of a sudden got passed in the session. Part of it was we moved to an open carry state, but also we didn't go to constitutional carry. What else can we give you?
Right.
What else can we say we've done?
Right. Because going into the session, I think, people that were inside the process, and we had both higher education chairs here, basically there was very little doubt that we were probably going to get campus carry. The interesting thing is that we got open carry, and I think open carry was seen as a much more extreme position. Mm-hmm. And they passed it. I mean, it took some effort, but it wasn't.
Yeah, most of the arguments around open carry were that I recall, were pretty fringe. I mean, they're sort of fringe issues. There's sort of acceptance that the law was going to get passed. It was more about, how does this affect policing? Right. Can police ask you to see your license if you're openly carrying a gun?
If the police see you open carry, are they allowed?
Enough? So there's things like that were kind of some of the big arguments, actually, that were interesting and complicated in their own way. But it wasn't about whether this was going to pass.
And it did make us look to the rest of the country a little bit on the fringe. Again, it was one of those things where the subtleties really get lost when the New York Times is writing a story that says, hey, in Texas, they want to be able to openly carry guns. Mm-hmm. There they go again. All right. So this is some of the background on as we go into with campus carry on campus. And I think on the UT campus, and I think we'll hear a lot more about this once the long semester resumes.
One fact we should add just before we jump to the next topic is, and people have said this a lot, and I think, this will change. But remember, you have to be 21 years old to get a concealed handgun license. So the fact is that
we don't want to give anybody the wrong idea. You do have to have a permit,
right? You do
a CHL, and go through the training to have a gun on campus.
It only takes 4 hours. I hear it's pretty easy.
It's worse than easy having gone through it.
But the point being, most college students on campus are actually not eligible to get the license and therefore legally carry the gun on campus. Right. Now, again, when you change the rules, all this stuff changes. But having said that,
that rule did not change.
That rule did not change. And the expectation is not that there's going to be just, tons and tons of students with guns on campus.
Yeah. President Fenves was on the NewsHour last night and repeated the statistic that's been widely, sort of circulated came out of the study group at UT that less than 5% of the UT population is expected to even be eligible to carry a gun. That is, to be old enough and to have the permit. All right, so maybe that's like, so it's cool.
Yeah, it's cool, guys.
It's not exactly what I meant to say, but that's kind of what it sounded like. And, I think we'll hopefully, I'm not going to say that. All right. Topic 2. Let's go back to the convention. So what do you think, Josh? How did the Democratic National Convention go for Hillary Clinton, and how do we know?
Well, I think it went pretty well.
I'm just going to step out.
Okay. So there's two, really what you look at in a lot of cases is the news coverage, because the convention is, a blip in time, but the news coverage kind of lives on. And it's not only that it lives on in the way that it's reported on in the moment, but it's sort of, what is the story that carries forward from these two conventions. And, sort of on the heels of the DNC, the news coverage focused on basically two main themes, right? One was just, the disparity in management between the Republican National Convention and the Democratic National Convention. Now, we talked last week about some of those issues with the Republican convention, right, and the Democratic convention was just seen as just a very well-managed affair from kind of start to finish in terms of the themes being consistent, the fact that there was no big-time speakers didn't endorse Hillary Clinton.
Right.
The concern about unity with the Sanders people was basically taken out of play after
it was
catharsis moment on Monday.
Right. It was a big thing on Monday. I mean, when we did the last podcast, it was still a little bit of an open question about how that was going to play out.
And it really didn't seem like an issue the rest of the week.
Yeah, it was pretty fine. And, we're conservative media, I think, accused the networks with maybe a grain of truth, but not a lot, that they were undercovering what dissent there was. Mm-hmm. But, nonetheless, the convention was managed in a way that was easy, and that was something that obviously the GOP had not managed.
Right. I mean, part of it is, we don't need to beat on the Republican National Convention that much, but if you think about, the lineup and sort of the level of the speakers, it's pretty easy at the Republican convention to cut away from Scott Baio or
Anthony Sabato Jr.
Yeah, or even sort of someone who's seen as a rising star, like a Mary Fallon or whomever, and trying to basically who's giving a pretty uninteresting speech by all accounts. It's
Students out there now are Googling Mary Fallon.
Hopefully, I hope you do,
or not.
But with Democrats, sort of were they going to cut away from Bill Clinton to show somebody? Not really, and I think
let alone Katy Perry.
Right, but the fact is, had George W. Bush spoken for Donald Trump at the convention, they wouldn't have cut away from him either.
But he was nowhere to be found.
So that said, one of the big takeaways was sort of the focus on management. The other was this sort of usurpation of the patriotism mantle.
Patriotism/optimism.
Right. Basically since Reagan, the Republicans have sort of tied their, sort of conservative principles with this idea of seeing America as, exceptional and this, place where anything can happen.
It's always morning in America.
It's always morning in America in the Republican Party. And if you'd watched the Republican convention, it was not morning in America. It was very dark and very dour.
It was like 4 a.m.
Right. It's 4 in the morning.
You're locked out of the house. You can't get in.
Right.
Nobody's home.
You're ordering a weight loss band on TV or something. Yeah. No, but basically for the Democrats, there was these, American flags and chants of USA. And in addition to not only sort of taking on the mantle of the patriotic party, which the Republicans have kind of owned for themselves, for better or worse, and kind of their popular understanding, they also were able to inject into patriotism this idea of diversity, that what patriotism really means and love for country really means is love for inclusion. And they were able to actually redefine the term in a way that was beneficial to them. So those were sort of the two kind of things. There was a lot of prominent Republican elites taking to Twitter and elsewhere and saying the Democrats just stole our stuff.
Yeah, I mean, and some pretty prominent Republicans, saying, I wish our convention had been like this.
Right.
In terms of the tone and the optimism. So
that's one. That was the media coverage, right?
That was the media coverage.
And then there's sort of the polling stuff, which we're always kind of interested in, right?
Which we talked about last time. We talked about the idea of a bounce. That is the notion that, one would expect that if a convention goes reasonably as planned and people are paying attention to it, that the poll numbers of the candidate being promoted by that party at their convention will go up, and we call that the poll bounce.
Right. And remember, this is a reflection of the fact that the party has basically a week to control the content that the media is going to cover.
Theoretically.
So, theoretically, that's the idea. So in an NBC, basically looking to today, in an NBC News SurveyMonkey poll, Clinton was up by 1 point last week. This week she's up by 8 over Donald Trump. In a CNN ORC poll, among Clinton supporters, 58% said that they were voting for her as opposed to voting against Trump, and that was up 10 points from the last time they polled that. Gallup found a slight bump for her, so that for people watching the Democratic convention, those saying they were likely to support Clinton increased by 4 points. However, for those people who watched the GOP convention, this is the big result.
Yeah, this is just
for people watching the GOP convention. There was a 15-point drop in those saying that they were likely to support Trump after watching the convention.
I think the only thing you can say to that is ouch.
Ouch.
That
and
hurts.
Also,
that really hurts.
And just to kind of go back to what the conventions are for, this is the first negative effect ever measured by Gallup. And this goes back to 1984 that they've been asking. So you watch the convention, did it make you more likely or less likely to support this candidate? And in all instances, Democratic convention, Republican convention, it always increases the likelihood of supporting that candidate because of these things that we're talking about. To see a drop and a big drop is just totally unprecedented.
So in terms of the technicalities of the bounce, she got a single-figure bounce, it looks like, but higher than what Trump got in his.
Trump was looking around 4 or 5 points, and she's looking about 7 or 8. It looks like
right. But the other kind of things that are coming out of the polling is that there was something of a negative effect coming out of the Republican convention. I have to go back to what we said last week: is that these don't tell us what's going to happen in the election now. They tend to come out in the wash over the long run. And
for the most part, they tend to remind the faithful. It's not about necessarily, it's not that the Democratic convention made a bunch of Republicans say, oh, now I really like Hillary Clinton, I'm going to vote for her. But it's more so about solidifying the Democratic base. The Republican convention is supposed to be more about solidifying the Republican base and then moving on from there.
Right. Now, I guess, as we look at those Gallup numbers and we'll see whether they're outliers or, how durable those effects are, it may well be that the conventional patterns will reassert themselves, but there is the possibility that, like so many other unconventional things here, that it's going to look differently this time, and largely because of the dynamic involving Donald Trump and his essentially usurpation of the Republican Party from, the plurality of Republican elites. And I think this was nowhere more apparent than the big story that really came out of the Democratic convention, as it turns out.
Continuing.
That is, continuing as we go. And, this revolved around the speech by Khizr and Khazala Khan, who talked about their son, Humayun, at the Democratic convention, and their son was a veteran who was killed in Iraq.
Right, he was a captain. He was a captain who was killed in 2004 by a car bomb.
Right, and he was he received medals for this. I mean, I think he ran out in front of his company. It was kind of an undeniably heroic act and situation.
Should say Muslim Americans.
And Muslim Americans. They were. The parents, he was American born. I believe the parents, they immigrated when he was a kid.
When he was 2 years old.
Okay, so they immigrated when he was 2 years old from Afghanistan. But prior, this was in the 90s. This was prior to the war in Afghanistan and prior to 9/11. So let's hear one of the audio excerpts from the Khan speech at the Democratic convention.
Have you ever been to Arlington Cemetery? Go look at the graves of brave patriots who died defending United States of America. You will see all faiths, genders, and ethnicities. You have sacrificed nothing and no one. We cannot solve our problems by building walls, sowing division. We are stronger together.
Now we should, point out that the "you" that Mr. Khan is referring to is Donald Trump. It was a direct, address to Trump, and obviously spoke to many of the elements of the Trump campaign. Got lots of publicity. Trump was asked about this then on the Sunday morning talk shows. Let's just go straight to an excerpt from this is Trump talking to George Stephanopoulos on This Week on ABC.
There was a man named Kaiser Khan speaking at the Democratic Convention. His son, Captain Humayun Khan, was killed serving in Iraq, and he had some very tough questions for you. He said you wouldn't have even let his son in America.
He doesn't know that. I saw him. He was, very emotional and probably looked like a nice guy to me. His wife, if you look at his wife, she was standing there. She had nothing to say. Maybe she wasn't allowed to have anything to say. You tell me, but plenty of people have written that. She was extremely quiet, and it looked like she had nothing to say. A lot of people have said that. And personally, I watched him. I wish him the best of luck, George.
What would you say to that, Father?
Well, I'd say we've had a lot of problems with radical Islamic terrorism. That's what I'd say. We have a lot of problems where you look at San Bernardino, you look at Orlando, you look at the World Trade Center, you look at so many different things. You look at what happened to the priest over the weekend in Paris where his throat was cut, 85-year-old beloved Catholic priest. You look at what happened in Nice, France a couple of weeks ago. I'd say you got to take a look at that because something's going on and it's not good.
He said you have sacrificed nothing and no one.
Well, that sounds, who wrote that? Did Hillary's scriptwriters write it?
How would you answer that, Father? What sacrifice have you made for your country?
I think I made a lot of sacrifices. I work very, very hard. I've created thousands and thousands of jobs, tens of thousands of jobs. I think
those are sacrifices?
Oh, sure, I think they're sacrifices. I think when I can employ thousands and thousands of people, take care of their education, take care of so many things, even in military. I mean, I was very responsible, along with a group of people, for getting the Vietnam Memorial built in downtown Manhattan, which to this day people thank me for. I raised, and I have raised, millions of dollars for the vets. I'm helping the vets a lot. I think my popularity with the vets is through the roof.
So where do you really begin on that? I guess you could begin by doing a roundup of those comments by saying he basically, jumps in the hole on gender, on culture and ethnicity, and on class. Mm-hmm. He basically, so he makes this cultural reduction. Mr. Khan's wife was standing there. She later came out, had an op-ed later that Sunday, and saying basically she's just too crushed by the loss of her son to really address it without breaking down. She was in tears as she left the stage. So he looks, he kind of implies she was not allowed. He didn't apply. He says basically she wasn't allowed to speak, just kind of a cultural slight.
Trading in stereotypes, certainly. And
then when they asked what he would say, he said, well, we have to worry about people from Middle Eastern countries being terrorists when their son had been in the military. And then when asked about whether he's sacrificed, his sacrifice is basically all the time that he spent
building his business.
Now, Donald Trump has gotten pretty far by being unconventional. Mm-hmm. And every time we think he's hit a limit case, it seems like maybe he has not.
Right.
So now the question is this a limit case? And what does that mean?
Well, and also, what would the conventional response have been? And the conventional response would have been, first of all, there's a couple things here. I mean, one, the speech was really well received that Khizr Khan gave, but it wasn't in prime time. It wasn't something that was going to be this perpetual thing that was likely to, kind of continue throughout the campaign. It's not like the Clinton campaign really wants to have Khizr Khan out there like as a surrogate for them. It was a good moment for the campaign, and they picked it for a reason, right? You have this, again, a Muslim family who's emigrated to America,
military service.
They've, made, people say, the ultimate sacrifice. In a lot of ways, they're sort of unimpeachable. As sort of as Americans and as citizens and as contributing to the country.
One would think.
And it would be so easy to just say something along the lines of, hey, I thank them for their service and their sacrifice, and, they're certainly allowed to have their opinions. I don't agree with them.
I certainly feel their loss and wish them the best.
And period. Right? But in some ways, by being so unconventional and by going back and sort of, needling them back, this isn't some public figure. This isn't, a politician of the other party or the Republican Party where he's saying, basically, this is not some elite or some, media personality. Right. This is just an ordinary family.
He could even have gone halfway and just picked on the husband.
Yeah, could have. That would have been something. Right? Now, I mean, So what is he trying to do here? Yeah. I mean, what he's trying to do is he's trying to sort of keep this in his terrain, which is to say, this isn't about, I'm not criticizing them. This is about, Islamic terrorism.
Right. Put it back in a different frame, but it's
really tricky here. I mean, the problem is, and this is sort of,
and I think it would take subtlety to do that.
It would take some subtlety. But I mean, here's an example of why this is sort of a tricky area. And this is sort of why the Democrats chose to put him up there too, which is even in Texas, we asked in our last poll in June, about different groups in society and how much discrimination they face. And in Texas, 73% of voters say that Muslims face a lot or some discrimination.
And that includes 64% of Republicans.
Right. This is not one of those, polarized response things like we talked about with gun control, where Democrats and Republicans feel differently. Again, a majority of Republicans say so. Even amongst those who say they're voting for Trump because they want him to be president. Again, not voting against Hillary. These are, solid Trump supporters. A majority, 54%, say that Muslims face a lot or some discrimination. Even among those who support a ban on Muslim immigration, 63% say Muslims face a lot or some discrimination.
Maybe they want to ban immigration to prevent them from being discriminated against.
Maybe. They're doing it for their own good. But at the same time, where this kind of gets complicated for Trump especially is, the military is the most favorably viewed institution, basically ever.
And that is the thing that really just, it's hard not to look at that and think, synaptic misfire, rookie mistake. There's just no way.
Right. I mean, 92% of Texas Republicans have a favorable view of the military. So to the extent that you're attacking, what they call a Gold Star mother, it's just, there's no win there for you.
Right. And Gold Star is the designation for parents that have lost a son or daughter in combat.
So the question is,
military service.
There's a sort of idea now, and a lot of because Trump is still talking about this, and there's a lot of sort of buzzing in the media. And
as we record this, analysts. It's 2 days later,
right? And this is still going on.
It's still going strong, and they're still commenting on it. But the president, kind of came down this morning on Trump about this. Over the weekend, Greg Abbott, governor of Texas, also said that essentially Trump should shut up about these people.
Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell said that they didn't agree. John McCain, who certainly is no fan of Trump, and Lindsey Graham likewise have come out pretty strongly saying this is not.
McCain was really, this has been connected with the comments that Trump made about McCain last year. He was at a forum, I think, or one of these town hall meetings, and he asked about McCain criticizing him, and he basically said that McCain, who had been obviously a POW for many years tortured during the Vietnam War, that he basically didn't think much of McCain because he preferred soldiers to not be captured.
Right. So he's not a war hero.
And he survived that.
Trump.
Maybe that's maybe he survived that. He feels like he can survive anything when it comes to the military. But I think. It's hard to really look at this and think of it as strategic.
No, and there's
we were talking about it earlier, and I was thinking about you saying, there's, what is the strategy here? I don't. This is one of those things where it's hard to see that there's a strategy here.
No, and so then the question becomes, does it matter, right? And I mean, and the thing is on its own, probably not. Right. And part of this is, there's a bunch of things that people learn about the candidates over the course of the campaign. And, whether you're likely to internalize that and make it part of your store of information about a candidate depends on how you feel. If you're a Hillary Clinton supporter, this is terrible. This is awful. Right. If you're a Donald Trump supporter, either you can couch it in terms that make you sort of accept why he's doing what he's doing or, whatever, or you just ignore it.
Well, this is something we talked about a little bit last week in another context. I mean, to the extent that it causes you maybe some cognitive dissonance that you're having to say, well, I really support Donald Trump, but I think this is really kind of awful. In a partisan setting like this with the negative feelings you have about Hillary Clinton, you wind up adjusting the dissonant part to your support for Trump. You de-emphasize it, you rationalize it, you look for other kinds of information that help you rationalize it. Khan is an immigration lawyer who works on visas, so of course he must be a bad guy.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, and so the thing is, but for the people who don't have such strongly attached opinions either way, let's say especially, this goes in
the compost pile.
Yeah, well, I would say it goes in another mark in the negative ledger.
Yeah.
Right, in your con column, right?
Right. Your con
column. Exactly.
C-O-N
con. Right. And, the fact is if you just add up enough of those over time, it forms a general impression that's going to eventually hurt. Is this one incident going to make some big change among, like, are we going to see, among the polling all of a sudden now we're going to see Clinton up 20 because of what? No.
Yeah, there's no silver bullet here for the Clinton campaign or for the Democrats.
But it's part of painting an overall impression that is,
I think, and again, this sounds a little mercenary, but in pure political terms, if you're a Democrat or you're a Democratic strategist, you're handicapping this campaign, it's undeniably a windfall, at least in the short and medium term plus for the Democrats that just came out of the convention as almost like an accidental, it's like an extra.
Yeah, it's a bonus.
It's a little bonus. And for Republicans, it's another headache. And for your Republican elite, like the people we've been talking about, if you're a Mitch McConnell or a Paul Ryan or a John McCain, it's just a forehead slapper. You're just going, this is going to be a really long campaign.
Self-inflicted wounds are the worst. And the thing is, again, for those Republican elites, they don't want to be running, spending most of their time campaigning trying to deal with Donald Trump's comments.
Because they've got their own stuff going on. They've got their own races to win or their own, irons in the fire here.
Exactly.
All right, so I think we're going to close it out there. That's it for this week's second reading. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project and the Project 2021 Development Studio at the University of Texas at Austin.